Hello.
Hello, Dr. Ibby.
Hello, Dr. Joe. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just getting ready to record the third episode of Say It Like You Play It, which is a new podcast about games, language and culture.
Ah, good to know.
Yeah. What are you doing?
Apparently the same thing.
Oh, that's why we're here in the same physical space with microphones in our faces. That makes sense.
No.
Shall we start off with an announcement?
What kind of announcement?
Well, for anyone who is listening to this, you might be interested to know that there is now a blog to go along with our podcast. Yeah, with every podcast episode, there is a blog post. So if you've listened to the first two episodes, you can go and check out our blog posts, which we've put online retrospectively. We're going to put the link to all the blog posts in the description below. And you can also check out the post for today's episode.
Yeah, they're sort of a summary of the episode, but they might be sort of structured in a slightly different way to how we present the information in the episode itself. So if you need them for something like a class or something like that, they might be more helpful than trying to scrub back through an entire episode to find a particular thing we referenced or whatever. So yeah, check those out.
They're also at times more in-depth, where we explore certain concepts or theories in a bit more detail, and there are also, at the very bottom, there's usually a list of useful references that you can have a look at as well, if that's what you are into.
Yeah, cool. Sort of more clarity, less of us goofing about kind of thing. So check those out if you are into that sort of thing. But today we are taking a slight departure from what we've done so far, because if you've listened to the first two episodes of Say It Like You Play It, they have been sort of text-based episodes where we've started with a game, we've started with a media object, and then we've talked about the language in it. And in this episode, we're going to take a slightly different angle where we are looking at a concept, I guess, that is within game studies and within kind of game design theory, where the sort of language used to talk about games and how they're made and how they work overlaps with some stuff from linguistics.
Yes, sometimes. Yes.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Or not.
Or
which
not.
is kind of what we're going to end up probably talking about a fair bit. So we want to look at the concept of a ludeme, which might be something that you've heard of before. It might be a totally new concept. And we're going to kind of go through the history of this concept as much as we can, and then kind of give our appraisal of how useful it is, I guess, from a general standpoint, and maybe within different disciplines, of like how useful is it to talk about things as if they're a language, because this is a concept that's coming partly from terminology within linguistics, and how useful is it to use this kind of language-based metaphor that sometimes morphs into other types of metaphors. How useful is that for helping us understand games? So we're not focusing on one specific book or paper here, because this is a piece of terminology that has a history across multiple different it doesn't even have a linear history, does it? Because different people quote unquote invent it at different times.
So as far as we can tell, it's been coined twice. Once in the environment of the 1970s in relation to board games and card games, and then a second time in the early 2000s in relation to video games. But we'll get to that.
Yeah, and I guess we should get into pretty quickly the part. Like we use in meme, the way that we use meme now to kind of describe something shared on the internet comes from Dawkins' Selfish Gene in 1976. And that means like a repeated unit of culture. So it's a similar concept to when we talk about tropes in media, but tropes are kind of bigger amalgamations of these things, and a meme can be something much smaller. But the thing that's important here when we're talking about ludemes and how they relate to concepts in language is that the eem suffix indicates the smallest unit of something.
Yes,
or a very small unit.
This actually comes from structuralism. So I found a very interesting short text that's called On the Origins of the Word Ludeme, which was published in 2019 by a French person, and I'm going to butcher French names now, Thierry Despoli, I think. And they say the following: it seems the word ludeme was coined in France in the early 1970s in the wave of structuralism, then intellectually dominant. Clearly, ludeme is derived from the Latin word ludus, game, with the suffix -eme, which was much used by the structuralist school following Ferdinand de Saussure's use of phoneme and grapheme. Thus we have morpheme and then mytheme, sememe, lexeme, and so on. Many other words ending in -eme that describe a basic element in some sort of structure.
So you mentioned Saussure there. So if we've got listeners who aren't from linguistics backgrounds, but maybe come from game studies or media studies, you know, Saussure is one of the people that always gets cited whenever you learn about semiotics, which is kind of one of the kind of, I hate to use the word innovations because that sounds like LinkedIn talk, but one of the things that the structuralists contributed, or one of their kind of parts of their toolkit for, you know, understanding how things work. And so you've got these ones that are to do with words, grapheme and phoneme, which I think we've talked about previously when we were talking about constructed languages. So a piece of the smallest unit of writing and the smallest unit of sound or language sound.
Yeah.
So a ludeme, you know, means a little bit of a game, effectively.
Yeah, it's a unit of game. And one of the interesting question that we're going to discuss now is what exactly is that unit of a game, right? Because different people have conceptualized ludemes differently in terms of, you know, what kind of animal is a ludeme, right? What's its content or form, and what are some of the features of ludemes? And that's kind of the key thing we want to discuss today.
Yeah, so it's one of the 2000s usages of ludeme that we looked at that people might be familiar with is from Costa, from Raf Costa. And we had a bit of a frustrating experience with this because he mentions it in a talk and he talks about it in a very extended blog post. So Costa's background is he's been a game developer since the early 90s, I think, and then he has an academic background in creative writing, so not necessarily in kind of research per se. But we found all of these kind of inconsistencies where he says, I talk about a ludeme here in Theory of Fun, and then you go and look in Theory of Fun, and because of the type of book Theory of Fun is, which is like a personal musings on a creative form rather than like a rigorous academic book, it's just mentioned there as, you can break games down into tiny bits, and I call them ludemes, and that's like the depth of it.
The interesting thing also is that Costa says that the term ludeme was coined by Ben Cousins in 2004. So this is the moment where Cousins and Costa sort of used the word ludeme without reference to this earlier structuralist use that other people have, or at least they sort of don't realise that other people before them have used.
You're not saying that they're thieves, just that.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I'm saying, well, at least Costa isn't. Costa says Cousins came up with it. But the interesting thing is, so apparently Ben Cousins talks about it in a 2004 article in the magazine Develop, which I could not find. I could not find this paper. So I don't know what he actually says. And then apparently he also gave a talk in 2005 called Low-Level Game Design, Atoms, Measurement and Hierarchies at the Game Developers Conference Europe. And I obviously wasn't at that conference and I didn't find any notes. So one of the issues is that at least I could not find what Cousins actually says ludemes are. All we have is Costa saying Cousins came up with it, and that actually since then he has renamed the concept as primary elements. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that stands out for me here, so this is taken from Costa's blog in 2006 on a piece called A Bit on How I Think Games Work. And he talks about a ludeme being a part of gameplay with no representational element. So for example, a chess piece that we call the knight, the name of it, of the knight, and the shape of it are not ludemes. The ludemes that make up the knight within the game are the way it's allowed to move, and that's it really, because that's what the chess pieces have that distinguishes them from each other. Is that, you know, they all move on a grid. That's a ludeme they share. And they all have different ways of moving on the grid, which is a ludeme that's different from piece to piece. And then they have different ways of taking each other. And there's, you know, and then there are kind of ludemes that are in the general game of, like, if one piece moves on top of another piece, then it eliminates it from the game. But anything that's metaphorical, like the idea that the knight is cavalry and that's why it jumps over other things, is not a ludeme, because that's a representational content, and that's like getting into the realms of like semiotics and things that you can see and name.
Yeah, so you could basically redesign the game chess, is the idea, and not have that sort of court metaphor overlying it. You could turn it into a modern war game where the knight is a tank instead, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Like we hear people talking about reskinning a video game, where the gameplay is exactly the same, but all of the visual content, the art style can be changed, but the gameplay stays the same. Now, there might be a relationship between those things where the metaphor helps you understand the gameplay, but in the way that Costa is talking about it here, it's trying to totally separate these elements, which, if you've ever done any game design, is quite hard to do, because players perceive the rules through the way they're represented, you know. And we see this with how, like, bodies are represented. If you see a skinny character in a video game, you assume they're going to move faster than the bigger character, but maybe have less health. They have all of these kind of metaphorical weight put onto the way things are presented. And this also comes at the same time as in the early 2000s, you have something that is written about in books about game studies as the ludology narratology debate, which is kind of potentially a bit of an artificial debate that didn't really exist at the time. But it was basically people that wanted to look at games as who were concerned with representation, like looking at Lara Croft as a male gaze object, for example, and then people that wanted to look at games as purely formal systems. Yeah. And this is obviously one of those kind of retroactively made up debates that was actually just, here's a field full of people with different concerns and different things they're interested in, and not actually people saying, oh, we should only think about this part of a game and not the other one. But this kind of represents one side of that, of this very extreme formalism of wanting to develop a language for speaking about games that doesn't get distracted by the packaging and is able to just talk about rules and stuff like that.
And this goes back to basically what he wants is to come up with a formal design notation system, right? So at least in the presentation notes that we looked at, he talks about notations for music, for instance, and for other
choreography, anything that you can turn into some sort of tablature and record the performance, which is an interesting parallel, because someone is performing in a game, but the person who's performing in a game is the player, and that's non-linear. So you already hit a potential issue there. So
I found a sort of tentative definition, and that's actually not in Costa's blog post, but in a comment that he made on the blog post, because there's a massive discussion going on underneath. And he says a game is a construct of rules. And I propose that for the sake of clarity, we refer to the bit that is just the rule construct as the ludeme. So that goes back to it's not the fancy decoration, but it's just a rule construct.
A game is the rules and the way that they are storified or represented through the pieces and the...
Yeah, so basically it's the mechanics, right? That's the ludeme. But then, quite interesting, I looked at another paper by a person called Nis Bogin from 2010, in which he talks about Cousins and Costa's definition of ludemes. And he actually says that their unit isn't a rule, but it's actually designed choice atoms. And summarizing Ben Cousins' conception of ludemes, which we don't have direct access to, he says the basic atomic unit of the choice experience, the interactive feedback loop that makes up the smallest unit of player engagement with the game, whether it's shooting an enemy, NPC, or leveling up the herbalist skill. So it's a unit of player engagement within a game, which is slightly different from a rule and what Costa says in that blog.
One of the things that comes out in that long set of back and forths in Costa's blog post is that ludemes don't actually have to be the smallest thing as well. And this is something we'll come back to again.
Yeah.
So they've got this atomist approach, so an approach of trying to identify what the smallest unit of something is, but then several times in not just in Costa, but in a couple of these accounts, a ludeme is allowed to be, one game mechanic or one rule, and then it's also allowed to be several of these things nested, which then kind of breaks the function of like the idea of this like atomist, what's the smallest thing?
Yeah.
And then we get into like needing different metaphors like atoms and molecules or whatever, but we'll come to that later, I think.
Yeah. All right, so that's Cousins and Costa, who partially say a ludeme is a rule building block, although Bogin says actually what they're saying is they are units of player engagement, which are slightly different, and maybe we can discuss which one we prefer later on. And that gets us to an essay called What's a Ludeme by David Parlett from 2006.
And this is the one that is more like a history of the term, right? And it goes back before those early 2000s authors and kind of identifies these earlier usages of...
So he obviously refers to what Costa and Cousins say, but he's also aware of the fact that there were people before in the 70s who came up with this term.
This essay is a really helpful resource for anyone who's trying to write about this in a broad sense. But in terms of what it tries to do with the terminology, I found it very frustrating because he's got this thing of, Parlett doesn't restrict a ludeme to the gameplay. So, for example, he calls the naming of the knight in chess a thematic ludeme.
Yeah.
Which is like... I can see why you would want to come at it from that point of view, because again, it's the fact that these things are linked and you can't really pull them apart, because the L-shaped movement and jumping over pieces is linked to the metaphor of it being cavalry.
Yeah.
So I understand how the theme and the ludic element are intrinsically linked, but it's still... Then it gets into this territory of like, well, everything is a ludeme, which is...
Yeah. So,
problem.
So in this essay, he actually quotes himself. He quotes a passage from a 1990s book that he wrote called Oxford Guide to Card Games. And the quote goes as follows. It helps to sort these gaming elements, or ludemes, into three types. mechanical, i.e. those governing the physical process of play, such as trick-taking or discarding to a sequence. Number 2, purposive, i.e. those defining the aim or objective of play, such as card capture or penalty avoidance. And 3, decorative, i.e. cultural motives, which are not essential to the gaming content, but add a measure of human or real-life interest to it. So that, specifically that third, decorative, is exactly what Costa says shouldn't be considered a ludeme. That's just a dressing up the dolly, right?
Yeah.
That, whereas Parlett says all 3 are ludemes, but they're different different species of ludemes.
And I guess if we go back to the linguistics terms that this is kind of aping, the Parlett approach of these are all ludemes would be like if we didn't have graphemes and phonemes and we just called them all linguimes.
Yes.
Like bits of language, right? And I guess that's what Parlett is arguing for.
Yeah.
And what we're getting towards with this is it a ludeme if it's thematic, is kind of going down the route of this kind of, if we're going to go down that structuralist route, then there should be a ludeme, which is a unit of gameplay, and then something else, which is a unit of representation.
Yeah. A theme-meme.
A theme-meme, yeah. Or just a meme.
Yeah, yeah.
And I, one of the things I thought was interesting in Parlett's model, and this kind of is what might make sense for anyone who's looking at games from a kind of computer science point of view, is that if you've got anything like a hierarchy or anything with numbers or values in, then the specifics in the game aren't the ludeme. The ludeme is the container for those things. So to give an example from chess, a diagonal or orthogonal movement rule is a ludeme, but the distance at which the different bits can move is just like a expression of that ludeme. It's not a separate rule to say this thing can move 1 in this direction, this can move all the way. Yeah. And the example he uses in cards is and the reason for this isn't arbitrary. The idea of it being a ludeme, and this is where we get out of linguistics and sort of into genetics, is that the thing that makes it a ludeme is that it's transferable between games. So once you've learnt that concept in one card game and you play another card game, then you still understand this concept. And the example he gives is if you have a hierarchy of suits in cards where diamonds is above hearts and hearts is above, the order of that hierarchy is not the ludeme, because that's just a specific thing to the game you're playing in, because you're playing hearts or whatever game you're playing. Yeah. But the idea that you can have a hierarchy of suits is then a transferable element between games. And the example I wrote down was like loot rarities. That's a really clear video game example of a hierarchy that we see in loads of video games now, and it has a visual thematic element that's repeated, and that goes back to, I think Diablo popularized it. I think some other games had it before.
Is this the grey, green,
blue, purple, and then orange or gold?
Yeah.
And there's a few reasons why it's popular. One of the reasons is it's quite colorblind friendly compared to other sequences of colors. But there again, we have the representational element of what colour goes with what isn't necessarily the ludeme, but the rarity is. And one of the things I think is interesting here is if we're going to use Parlett's definition, then you could classify the hierarchy of the rarity of the items as one ludeme, and the hierarchy of the power of the items as another ludeme. And they don't necessarily, I mean, we assume they line up. But you might have a game where there's a very rare item that doesn't really do anything and isn't actually more powerful. But most of the time we assume that they line up. So, and then that gets into like, can you compound them together and have these two things that are supposed to be a single unit but are actually two things running parallel, which is kind of what happens in your brain when you see one of those loot rarity color coded things. Yeah.
So despite the fact that he sort of puts a lot of things in the ludeme pot that are maybe different things, what I like about this essay is, one, that he actually provides a number of potential characteristics of ludemes, and one is the one you just said, which is that it's transferable, or how he puts it is that they have a propensity to propagate. So they pass on from one game to another. And then the other one is that they are contrastive, and he compares that with the linguistic notions of phonemes and morphemes. And contrastive means that if you substitute one ludeme for another, you change the system and you get a different game. Similar, if you change a phoneme or a morpheme in a language, you get a different word. So to give you an example, so in English, for instance, the L sound and the R sound are two different phonemes. So lid versus rid are two different words. But in Japanese, for instance, they are not two different phonemes. They're actually allophones of the same phoneme. So they're variants of the same phoneme. And so that's why often Japanese speakers will, when they speak English, they will mix them up. What's interesting is that Pollitt's claim or sort of argument that we should only consider something a ludeme that is contrastive and that changes the game in a fundamental way if you substitute one ludeme for another, sort of, I think, disqualifies what he calls decorative ludemes from actually being ludemes, because if I reskin chess to be a modern war game, or reskin it to something else where the pawn is no longer a pawn and the king is no longer a king, it doesn't change any of the actual gameplay. So that's not really a contrastive feature that significantly changes the game. It just changes what the game looks like.
I think it could change the experience of the game for certain people, right? If you made the game sort of really thematically horrific in some way, so that it was upsetting, that would change the. But that's different from what we're trying to talk about here, which is like this kind of. I guess that the problem with it is the problem with any kind of formalism where you're trying to get into like a universal experience of encountering an object, which doesn't really exist. But they want to be able to talk about that. But the representation wouldn't change that necessarily, but it would change how particular individuals interact with the object. If you made a game of chess that was about something really contentious or upsetting, then some people would just play it exactly the same as chess, and some people would play it and be like, "Oh, I don't want to play this. It makes me feel bad."
All right, that is Pollitt all done, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that essay is a really good one if you just want like the bottled history of this word that goes back before 2000.
Yeah, and we're probably going to put all of the references in the description, but also, again, they'll definitely be in the blog post as well.
Yeah, and clickable maybe if you're lucky.
Yeah.
And then, the next one on the list I've got here is the 2021. There's a conference presentation and a paper that go together.
Yes, so I have it's basically the written up paper in the conference proceedings of the 13th Board Game Studies Colloquium.
And this is Cameron Brown. So it's called Everything's a Ludeme, well, almost everything.
Yeah.
Which is a good summary of everything we've spoken about so far. And this is what happens when you try and make specialist language. You can try and include everything, and then it becomes meaningless, or you can try and be exclusive, and then what do you actually gain or lose by being more exclusive of things? So, what does Cameron Brown say? Cameron Brown kind of gives us the history of the term again, to some degree.
Yeah, so he summarises a bunch of literature on the term ludeme and how it's been used. And he sort of summarises that there are generally 3 properties that people largely agree on that ludemes have, and then he proposes a 4th one that he says is contentious but part of his conception of ludemes.
Yeah.
So the 3 agreed upon properties, he says, ludemes are discrete units. So, for instance, the move of the knight is a discrete unit, and that is a ludeme. But how he says something that's quite similar to what Costa says, namely, this does not imply that they cannot be decomposed into simpler subunits, just like genes, basically. So ludemes aren't necessarily the smallest units or meaningful units. Then the second one is that they are transferable, which basically is exactly what Parlett said about their propensity to propagate. So transferable means you can substitute them or put different ludemes together and create a new game. And then that they are contrastive. Again, that's what Parlett said, that they are meaningful in the sense that if you do substitute one for another, you get a different game experience. And then the fourth one, which he says is potentially contested, but he argues applies at least to his understanding of ludemes, is that they can be compounded. So there are two kinds of ludemes, he says. There are atomic ludemes, which are basically, I assume what he means is the smallest unit, although calling them atomic ludemes is a misleading metaphor because we know that atoms can be divided into smaller things, right? But I think,
not when they were not when the concept was
no, fair enough.
formed,
Yeah. So I think he means by atomic ludemes is like smallest non-divisible parts, and then you have compound ludemes, which consist of atomic ludemes.
Yeah. So the example was a piece can be destroyed, right? The possibility that a piece can be destroyed, captured, taken off the board is one ludeme.
Yeah, and that's an atomic ludeme.
And another atom could be you can move on top of another piece. And then you can have a linked concept of, in order to capture a piece, you move on top of it.
Yeah.
And that whole movement of moving and capturing at the same time is two ludemes then becoming one, because as a concept, as you sit down and play the game, you are no longer thinking of those two things as separate. They are like inherently together. There's not a situation in a game of chess or checkers where you land on an opponent's piece and it doesn't get taken. And that's what means that that's why you can have this molecular I don't think he calls it a molecular ludeme, but that's kind of what we're getting towards, is there's a concept of capturing, there's a concept of moving, and moving and capturing can only ever happen together, right? I mean, moving can happen on its own, but capturing can't happen without moving.
Yeah.
So the concept of like what capturing is when you play the game, it's always part of a move, which basically means you have two types of move. You have a move, and then you have a move where you capture something at the end. Yeah. And you can't, although capturing something conceptually is its own thing, it can't really exist without the move. So you end up with this thing that's a ludeme that's made up of several other things. Yeah.
Yeah, so those are the properties he talks about. And then he talks about three dominant models of ludemes, which sort of goes back to what we said at the beginning about the history of the term. And yeah, let's just go through them. I think there are some things that maybe are overlooked in this description. So he says there are three dominant models of ludemes. The first one is the mimetic model. So basically that's the model where the notion of ludemes resonates strongly with Dawkins's notion of the meme. And we said earlier, a meme is basically a unit of cultural transmission or a unit of imitation. And so he says that there are some scholars who conceptualize of ludemes similar to what Dawkins says about memes. And what's interesting is that he says, it surprised me to learn that the invention of the term ludeme predates the invention of the term meme by several years, because apparently someone came up with this term in the early 70s before Dawkins came up with the meme in his 1977 book. But if we think about, again, the structuralist thinking at the time, it's not really that surprising.
Yeah.
Then the second one, so the mimetic model is the first one. The second one is the emic model. Mm-hmm. In which ludemes may be compared to the linguistic model of emic units. So basically this is things like morphemes and phonemes, right? And again, what he misses is that basically both the linguistic emic model and the mimetic model are structuralist approaches, right?
Okay, but the difference here is that the mimetic model can be you can be transmitting a relatively large thing, whereas the emic model is about the smallest knowable components of something.
Yeah.
And Brown says that he doesn't find the emic model particularly useful. It's an interesting intellectual exercise, but it's not necessarily fruitful. Mm-hmm. And then we've got the video game model.
Yeah. Which is basically going back to what Cousins and Costa came up with in the early 2000s.
And it's conceding that emic, it must be the smallest thing, and going back to this idea of it's the smallest thing, but sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's 3 small things in a trench coat.
Yeah. Yeah. And interestingly, here Brown says that Costa's and Cousins' video game model is actually, he says, too broad, which is interesting. So he doesn't like either the video game model nor the linguistic emic model particularly. But then maybe it ends up somewhere in the middle, I think. So at the very end, his final definition is the following. A ludeme is a discrete unit of information relevant to any game which may be atomic or compound in nature and which can be readily transferred between games to change the function of the game in at least one plausible case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of contains all of the useful stuff from the previous definitions while clarifying a bit more.
Yeah, although I still find that quite vague in terms of a discrete unit of information. What kind of information? You know, what, again, this is back to the question of what animal. Is it what Parlett said, where you can have different animals of ludemes or not?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of makes me think a lot about that distinction between rules and variables from earlier on, because you can change a variable in a video game in the programming a very small amount, and hundreds of thousands of people might play it and never consciously notice that difference.
Yeah.
And that's why we have, there's an approach to design called orthogonal design, which is basically where when you have things that are within a category, you try and make each of them very different from each other. So the way that chess pieces move is an example of orthogonal design. They are all different, whereas in a game of checkers, all the pieces move the same. If you had a game of chess where all the pieces moved the same, but the difference between them was they had different attack powers, right? Then changing one of those attack powers from 7 to 8, it would change the game statistically over time if you watch loads of matches where and you would eventually have someone come up on the internet and go, oh, bishops are overpowered, you know, or whatever. But like the single game of just your immediate interaction with the game would not change dramatically, whereas changing the way a piece moves and like having a chess variant where you know, knights can't jump over things or whatever is a dramatically different change. So I think that distinction is quite helpful.
Yeah.
But I also don't, I guess because I'm coming to this from a video games point of view, I don't see the usefulness of this terminology when you're just creating another metaphor to put on something that already exists in the programming anyway. And one of the things that Brown does develop in these papers that I got about halfway through and then noped out of was like a Java-based programming language to be able to basically tell a computer about all of the rules of a game using a programming language. Yeah. not to actually program it, just to describe how a game works. But some of that does get into interesting territory of it's really annoying to be stuck on chess examples here, but they all use chess examples. So the transferability of a ludeme can all depend on how it's expressed. So we had the knight example in the Brown piece, which was like the checkerboard on a chessboard is not really that relevant, the fact that it's black and white. Until you start to do this trying to transfer between games thing. So if you say that a knight moves in an L shape, then that is a ludeme that can only transfer to other games that use a grid, that use a square-based grid. But if you say the knight can move from its current space to the nearest space of a different colour.
Second nearest.
Yeah, the second, basically a non-adjacent space of the opposite colour from the one it's on, which is really a mouthful. But that allows you to transfer the rule for movement onto a hexagonal grid or a bunch of different other types of boards. So the way that you express the rule, the ludeme, sort of changes its transferability to other games, which I think is interesting, because I think if there's any value to this whole way of looking at things from a design perspective, it is this kind of transferability. How can you just pull something out of a game and put it into another game and understand how that might impact the things around it? And being able to think about things in that abstract way can help that. And I guess that's why it's so important to be able to decouple the rules from the representation, even though players don't do that necessarily.
Which what you just said brings me to this question of, variously here, ludemes are basically used as metaphors, right? Or very often when people talk about ludemes, what happens is that we get these underlying metaphors of trying to describe games as some other kind of system, right? So metaphor generally is describing a thing as something else, right? So if I say, you are my sunshine, right? Then then I don't mean that you are literally sunshine. I mean that you share some qualities that sunshine has, right? So you have what's called a source domain, sunshine, which has some qualities, and I map those qualities of the source domain onto the target domain, which in this case might be you, right? And so a lot of these discussions of ludemes, there are metaphors popping up like all the time. So we have the idea of atomic units, for instance, right, where you have the metaphor of game as the physical matter.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Right. Then we have the comparisons with linguistic units like phonemes and morphemes, right, where we have the metaphor of games as language systems. Then we have comparisons to the concept of the meme, but really what we have to remember that the meme is mapping culture and cultural content onto the idea of organisms and biology, right?
Which is a similar thing to what we do when we talk about virality on the internet. Because
Dawkins, who wrote The Selfish Gene and coined the term meme, he is a evolutionary biologist, right? So we have those different metaphors where we map properties of either evolution or linguistic systems onto games. And the question that I had reading all of those texts was, how well does that work? How useful is it? And how much can we actually, what are they actually mapping onto?
Yeah, because one of the things that I couldn't stop thinking about was like, how is this an improvement on mechanics?
Yeah.
Because that's what we usually use to talk about gameplay separated from theme and story.
Yeah.
And I think there is maybe some benefit to the idea of the ludeme, just because mechanics is such a confusing terminology.
But then the way that ludeme is used isn't any less confusing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So it could be fruitful if it was modified and settled in a particular way.
Yeah.
But I mean, the way that we talk about mechanics, and if you're from a board games background, people tend to talk about the individual game mechanics as mechanisms. Like, you can move. If you move here, this happens. Each of those is a mechanism.
Yeah.
And then when a board game designer or player talks about mechanics, they are using mechanics in the kind of broad, inclusive, like, all of the mechanisms in this game.
That's the entire system of mechanisms, right?
Yeah, the game's mechanics, the workings. They're looking at the entire clockwork, how it all goes.
So it's the entire grammar. So the mechanism is an individual grammatical rule, if we map it onto a language, right? And then the entire thing is the grammar of...
Whereas in video game design and video game criticism, when we talk about mechanics, we can say, the game's game mechanics, and we're talking about all of the mechanics. Or you could be talking about a mechanic. And that feels a bit different to be talking about a mechanic as opposed to a mechanism. Yeah. And it's just this weird, different use of language you get in these different areas of design. Yeah. And one of the differences, I think, if you say, let's talk about the game mechanics, that could come across like, okay, this game has 12 mechanics in, but we're going to talk about 3 of them or whatever. Yeah. Whereas if you're using it in the board game sense, so let's talk about the mechanics, it's like, how does the entire thing fit together? And just because there's that weird need for disambiguation around what a mechanic is, I think a ludeme could be helpful there, and especially when you are trying to emphasize this transferability. Yeah. But again, it's kind of drawing from all these different places. And I think the atomist view, where a ludeme is a small bit of interaction, and then you need that other thing, you need the equivalent of a phoneme or whatever to be a thememe, like I said earlier. I think that could work, of like to have a system where all of these different things are accounted for, rather than saying, we're going to atomize gameplay and then just not talk about theme at all in this system. I think a system where you atomize gameplay and then you also atomize theme, and you atomize all the different things that make up a game, and allow those things to sit together like phonemes and graphemes do within, or graphemes do within linguistics. I think that might be helpful to someone, but I'm not sure in what way. I find, it's interesting what you say about like the need for disambiguation in terms of mechanics, and I think that maybe ludemes might be a way to do that, but I think the way that it's currently used, it isn't useful yet, because as we've been discussing, it's still a confusing term that people use in very different ways, so it doesn't actually help. But I also agree that where I find the notion interesting is when people actually give it specific qualities, like the transferability. But then the interesting thing about the transferability, which you get in memes, right, as well. Yeah. So that actually maps onto evolutionary theory, right, where really a ludeme is a gene. And you can, so the game is an organism, and you can combine different genes to make a specific organism. And if you change a ludeme / gene, then you change the organism / game, right? Yeah. And then if you use a comparison with like the linguistic units like phonemes or morphemes, you get that idea of them being contrastive, which I think is also quite interesting. But beyond that, I'm not sure how useful the trying to map linguistic system onto game is beyond that. Because another interesting thing that I was thinking about is there's actually a branch of historical linguistics that looks at how languages change and how different features, different words or grammatical constructions like pop up and become a thing that people start using, or features die out, whatever.
Languages change over time. Different language variants develop out of one parent, etc., etc. And they are using basically mapping language onto evolutionary theory and onto organisms, where they say things like we have two languages, like, I don't know, French and Italian, right? And they have a common ancestor, right?
They have a little baby.
No, they have a common ancestor.
Oh, they have a little
right?
grandma.
Latin.
Yeah.
Right? So you have Latin with its specific features / genes, and Latin spread into different environments, and then it adapted, right? And changed, and certain features changed, and then at one side of the continent you get Italian, and a different area of the continent you get
Romanian
and French, and so on, right? Just like a species, if it goes out into different environments, changes, its genes will adapt. And at like the specific level of linguistic features, you get this idea that language changes and new features pop up, just like genetic mutations. People have for a very long time used the word literally to mean literally, right? But then at some point there was a genetic mutation where someone used literally to mean figuratively. And maybe that's already happened a lot before it caught on, and that mutation then just died out in a certain environment. But then at some point it popped up, it mutated in the right environment where other people started adopting it, and so it became a feature / gene that actually survived and spread.
Yeah. So the butterfly thing as well. So apparently butterflies used to be called flutterflies in English.
I've heard this. I've heard this before.
Is that fake?
Well, I don't know. I like it, but I don't know.
it's too tempting, isn't it?
Yeah. So anyway, what I was getting at, there are linguists who actually use the language as organism metaphor, which is quite interesting, that with ludemes we have this thing where people are using both the organism and the language metaphor. Which
we do all the time, right? We talk about the genealogy of something that isn't genetics. Like we talk about when we talk about music and influences and art influencing other art, we will talk about a genealogy. We do it we do it very naturally. I think there's I don't want to get super into it now, but I think there's maybe within academia there's an interesting conversation to be had about how people pick these metaphors and why. And is it to do with appealing to a specific audience? Is it to do with being perceived as more legitimate? If you can be the linguist who stands there and seems to know more about biology than everyone else, or if you can be the game designer who stands there and knows all this stuff from linguistics,
because I think what you're getting at is the question: are certain metaphors more prestigious than other metaphors? Right?
And particularly with games, right? If you go back to 2000, you've got sort of. I'm trying to find a word that's not seminal, because seminal is a terrible word. It's sort of like early game studies texts in the 90s, and then in the early 2000s you've got, it's sort of like people in universities trying to fight for the right to even study games at all. And they are presenting to audiences. You might have small conferences of actual game studies people where everyone knows what everyone's talking about, and then you've got game studies people going to humanities conferences or computer science conferences and having to sort of fight for legitimacy by hitching their wagon to something that other people care about. And it might be that they go down a sci-tech route of how is this thing a computer science thing, or it might be that they go down a humanities route of like, what are people in my institution going to respect? What are people at a conference going to respect? And I find that interesting because there might have been a point where that was the case in linguistics, right? And a field when a field is in its early stages and it doesn't feel legitimate, is kind of like trying to attach itself to other things, and then later on that field becomes the thing that someone else is using for legitimacy because it's more established. Yeah,
that's very interesting.
It's almost like a sort of biological process.
An evolutionary process.
An evolutionary process of academic fields lumbering around in the wild, eating each other.
Everything is evolution, I think. Everything can be reduced down to evolutionary theory.
Yeah. It's the evolution of man image.
Yeah.
With the apes and then the man, and then there's a anthropologist, and then there's a linguist, and then there's a Ralph Costa at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's writing this little theory of fun book. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we've been through everything in our notes, and I think this was quite an experimental format for us, because before we've talked about specific games, whereas this is very broad. So let us know how you got on with that. If you want to kind of contact us or leave any feedback that way, you can do.
Yeah, we would love a comment. We would love a ideally 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. I think the blog posts also have a comment feature if you want to comment on that.
They do. And yeah, again, as we said earlier, the blog post would be a really helpful resource for you if you need direct links to any of the resources we've talked about, because we haven't touched on everything that everyone we've spoken about has said about this, because we're trying to approach it as like a kind of a broad thematic thing. But if this is an area that you're studying or looking at studying, then you should get quite a good reading list on this subject from the blog post.
Yeah. And I think the final thing is, if you want to support us, then you can also buy us a coffee at Buy Me a Coffee. Link in the description.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it for today. Thanks for listening.
No.
Okie dokie.
Let's get it.